sides of her family and has a diagnosis of major depression and complex PTSD herself. She understands what it means to be a suicide attempt survivor, a person with lived experience, and an impacted family member. Her experience with mental illness has also been impacted by her cultural perspective and experience as a Japanese American woman whose father was imprisoned in an internment camp during World War II. Dr. Soyamoto will be discussing the impact of all these issues across 3 generations as she explores the experience of telling and hearing stories that can heal and empower individuals and communities, as well as develop cultural humility and suicide prevention. With no further ado, let me welcome Dr. Pada Soyamoto.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg. Let me tell you a little bit more about me, just a little bit. Greg did a great job, thank you. And welcome everyone. So I am the co-chair of the Greater Boston Regional Suicide Prevention Coalition and the chair of the Massachusetts Coalition for Suicide Prevention's Alliance for Equity's People of Color Caucus. I also serve on MCSP's executive committee. I am one of the authors of Widening the Lens, Exploring the Role of Social Justice in Suicide Prevention, a Racial Equity Toolkit. I earned my PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and did my research on anti-racist education and issues of race and racism. I'm a feminist scholar, writer, educator, diversity trainer, mental health activist, jewelry designer, and avid bicyclist. As Greg mentioned, I speak and write about being a suicide attempt survivor and my struggles with depression and complex PTSD. I'm also the co-founder of the Breaking Silences Project, which is an artistic endeavor that educates about the high rates of depression and suicide among Asian American young women. And finally, my claim to fame is that I rode my bicycle across the country in the summer of 2012. So the structure of the talk today is I'm first going to share a TED-style talk about my lived experience, and it starts and ends with short videos. Then I'll present on the functions of story in my life and in mental health and suicidology in general. And finally, there'll be ample time for a Q&A, and I hope to have a lively discussion with all of you, rather than trying to put interactive stuff in the middle of things. I'm going to wait till the end. So if you do have questions, please feel free to use the chat. Jen is monitoring that for me, so I can make sure that I answer all your questions along the way at the end. Okay.
The newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, a land that was raw and tame and full of opportunity.
Well, then we got orders. I think we got to move out and pack up things within 3 or 4 days. I remember going to the church when we were in order to go. And I remember waiting in line to get fed. We drew apart, really, once we went to camp.
Live in uncertain times. Being an attempt survivor and a person who struggles with PTSD and major depression is even more difficult now. Being a person of Asian descent is also more difficult now, given the anti-Asian racism that has taken hold due to misinformation, bias, fear, and hatred. These two threads are the basis of this talk and why we need to think about the impact that mental health and racism have not only on particular individuals, but also on families and among generations. This story is not linear. It is not neat. It is not easy either. I stand in the middle. I am from a mixed heritage family with a history of systemic trauma. My father was Japanese American and imprisoned in an American concentration camp during World War II. This experience shaped his life and impacted his understanding of what it meant to be Japanese American. I have heard that my father was an outgoing activist when he was young, as evidenced by the fact that he led a student walkout in the camp after a teacher said a racist remark. But this is not the man I knew growing up. I believe that racism had worn him down, and he became more reclusive, preferring to stay at home with immediate family rather than going out to try to change the world. He tried, unsuccessfully, to assimilate, to hide his Japaneseness. We lived in a primarily white community in a suburb of Boston, one with good schools. I always knew I was different, and the people around me wouldn't let me forget. I grew up with the question, "What are you?" And when kids would call me chink, I would retort, "At least get it right, I'm a Jap." Yet we lived in a household imbued with Japanese culture, which was unspoken. My father couldn't escape his cultural upbringing and passed it down to us. But perhaps, unlike other households where culture was overt, ours was covert. My father valued family, and you weren't supposed to take our business outside of our nuclear group. There was a silence around my mother's and then my own mental illness. Education was expected. And then there were the more superficial things like eating rice and tea, which I later found out is not just an anomaly of my family, but a thing in Japan too. We had one Japanese record of folk songs that I used to dance to when I was young. My favorite song was Haru ga Kita, or Springtime is Coming. I have a friend who lives in Japan and is constantly saying that the things I do are so Japanese. Yet until she says that, I wouldn't have known so. Although growing up, my father was imprisoned in an American concentration camp, my father really didn't speak about camp until I asked him to present to my American history class in the 11th grade. It was an enlightening moment for me. I didn't realize until much later that I had asked him to do something difficult, that speaking about camp was not only a reliving of trauma, but also a huge ask of my reclusive father. I was proud of him. His take-home message was it could happen again. This was 1978. This was the beginning of my understanding of the impact that experience of being in camp had on me and my father. The trauma of the camps influenced how I feel about being Japanese American. How I've always felt like I don't quite belong. It has made me question my worth. It makes the current overt racism even more frightening. I wonder what it would have been like to be accepted in my community growing up. And this lack of sense of security and belonging can be traced to my family's experience with camp and the ongoing othering and racism that I and other Asian Americans feel every day. My daughter identifies as multiracial Asian American, and she flies under the racial radar because she passes as white. Yet, if she had been alive in 1942, she would have been in prison too, as anyone who was 1/16 Japanese was an enemy of the United States. However, unlike me, my daughter grew up with culture as a topic in our household. Not just Japanese American culture, but other cultures as well. Her early years were spent in Philadelphia, where the black-white binary is very much in play. She was aware that we didn't fit into that split, And to be honest, I'm not sure how that sense of racial ambiguity affected her. I do know that she is a social justice warrior and learned early on about how oppression works and to question it. She learned to embrace her heritage as Japanese American, Polish American, Anglo American, and Jewish. She has a Japanese first name, and half of her surname is Japanese as well, which I am sure is confusing for others at times. And sometimes I know it is challenging for her to claim her Asianness in the face of others' doubts. Yet, for the most part, she is centered in her multicultural being, and for that, I am thankful. I stand in the middle. I am a person with chronic complex PTSD and major depression. When I was 16, I tried to take my life. I am a survivor. And I stand in the middle. I'm sandwiched between a mother who had bipolar disorder with psychotic features and a daughter who struggles with complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, and ADHD. In addition, my aunt died by suicide. My uncle and father dealt with depression in their lifetimes. When I was younger, as the oldest daughter, I took care of my mentally ill mother. I was a parentified child. When my mother was taken to the psychiatric hospital, I was tasked with taking care of her household as my parents were divorced. I would gather bills for her to pay during our visits, clean the refrigerator so food wouldn't spoil, and protect my sister from caregivers with unreasonable expectations. I remember a time when my mother was in the hospital and a caregiver told my sister, who was maybe 3 or 4, to clean her room. I remember distinctly saying that she was too young to do what was being asked. I was 7 or 8. These hospital stays were stressful because they interrupted our lives and routines. It was scary and disorienting to have my mother behave in ways that were odd at best and alarming at worst. My mother would rewash all the clean clothes, or rearrange all the furniture in ways that made no sense, or give away treasured things that we had made for her to neighbors she didn't know. She would hide in her darkened room, holding herself as if she might break if she did not. Visiting my mother in the psychiatric hospital was also difficult. It was hard to see my mother so ill and helpless. It was hard to see her in places that were so clearly not helpful or therapeutic. One time when my mother was in a state hospital, she reported that staff were rough in handling her. During that stay, my mother, who was also a registered nurse, cleaned the bathroom, which was dirty with urine and feces. Her professional sensibility wouldn't let her leave it to others. Hearing these stories and experiencing these institutions that did more harm than good made a lasting impact on my life and shaped my mother's relationship with her own illness. Throughout my mother's lifetime, I took care of her when she was ill. There were very few times when anyone asked me how I was doing or reached out with support. I never knew that what I was doing was not normal until I got into my own therapy and was asked to consider what if my daughter had to do what I did when I was 7, 8, 10, 15. As a mother, I rebelled. No way, she is the child. This made me realize that I too was the child. I was being asked to do things that were beyond my age. I was in a situation which was unstable, unpredictable, and at times dangerous. And there were no supports for me in this situation, the result being my own complex PTSD. I wonder if this could have been mitigated had someone intervened. And even as I got older and took care of my mother, there was never an acknowledgement of the impact that her mental illness and suicidal ideology had on me. I stand in the middle. My daughter has ADHD and has always run anxious. However, since the murder of her father when she was 18 years old, she also suffers from PTSD and depression. When she was growing up, I did my very best to change the dynamic and not place her in the position I had been in growing up. I did my best to be honest with her and told her, even when she was 3 or 4, that mommy has an illness that makes her sad, and it's not your fault. Not your fault. Because children think everything in their sphere is their fault. That is the child mind. I worked hard in therapy to understand that I was not responsible for my mother's illness, even though there were times she explicitly blamed me. I also did my best to tell Nico that I had people to help me and that she was not responsible for me. I remember a time when she made herself up as a clown and tried to cheer me up. I thanked her for her efforts and reminded her that she didn't have to do that. Reminded her that mommy had helpers and that things would be okay. Although she had ADHD, she didn't suffer from major mental illness until her father was murdered. At this point, I became a caregiver and support to her. She needed help finding a therapist and a psychopharmacologist. She needed someone to call at 3 a.m. when she was going down the rabbit hole. I feel blessed that we have the kind of relationship where I was that person. I feel blessed that I have the tools to help. I also feel exhausted. I stand in the middle. I have my own mental health issues to contend with. I am the person who has mental health illness and suicidal ideology, and the impacted family member who cares for others. Intergenerational trauma weaves in and out of my story. And what is the impact of these two aspects of my story on me growing up and now? First, growing up, there was a deep sense of shame. Shame about being different and not fitting in. Shame in my family where my mother's illness was never named, where she was sick and her diagnosis was never discussed or explained. I also had the constant feeling that I needed to apologize when she was off or acting actively psychotic. People looked to me to do something, but what was there to be done? I couldn't control my mother's illness or her behavior. I couldn't will her to stop being psychotic, nor could I convince her to go to the hospital to get treatment. I remember one time a neighbor of my mother's called me when my mother was being loud and disruptive. I, of course, immediately tried to calm my mother, and when that didn't work, I reluctantly told the neighbor to call the police. I was helpless to impact my mother's behavior when she was in that state, and felt shame that I couldn't. And that shame about mental illness was internalized as well. I spent a long time being ashamed of my own mental illness, feeling that it was somehow my fault and that I was weak and a bad person for being mentally ill. This shame was still debilitating at times. I no longer feel that way, but I see this sentiment in my daughter and actively work to counter that narrative, to make her realize that her illness is not her fault, that it's no one's fault, but she does, in my opinion, have a responsibility to deal with it so as not to harm others or herself, so as to live the best life she can with the challenges that are before her. The racism that I and my family experienced took a different toll. I internalized that too and felt, and sometimes still feel, like a perpetual outsider, like I somehow don't belong wherever I am. I know this feeling isn't mine. I have this feeling because we live in a society that is fundamentally and structurally racist. I am not the problem. Knowing this and feeling this are different, however. One way I combat my own internalized racism is by actively countering it by being an activist. This work is not only to make the world a better place for all of us, but also very personally to create an alternative personal narrative where my race and history are strengths. This way I leave a different legacy for my daughter. And what does it mean to live with mental illness and support others who also struggle with mental illness? What does it mean to live with suicidal intensity and support others with the same? It means, for one, that I understand these feelings can be survived. And it also means that I understand that people die from these feelings. And because of that, I speak out. Because of that, I know we need to do better. We need to understand that we cannot separate the threads of family, culture, historical context, and intergenerational mental illness and trauma. These aspects are woven together into the tapestry of lived experience. And we can no longer address just an individual with their specific diagnosed illness. Instead, we must look broader and support the individual and their network of impacted family and friends. We must understand that the dominant culture works hegemonically to frame our experiences and to downplay its impact and effect on people of color and our mental health. None of us is absolved from the responsibility to understand that suicide is not a problem of one individual. Suicide is contextual, cultured, and impacts many. None of us can afford to remain ignorant and silent to these facts. If we want to save lives, we need to be courageous enough to look at the whole problem and not be satisfied with only addressing a part. We need to speak our truths. We need to take a stand.
Haru ga kita, haru ga kita, doko ni kita. Yama ni kita, sato ni kita, no ni mo kita. Springtime is coming, springtime is coming. Where is spring now? Here in the mountains, here in the village, and here in the fields. Springtime is coming, springtime is coming. Where is spring now?
So that's the first part of this story, the personal first part. And the second part is a weaving together of some thoughts on the impact of story in my life and in general, and other pieces of my story along the way to illustrate it. So for me, there's been an important therapeutic impact in telling my story to myself, which has transformed me internally. Story has been a powerful tool in my healing, both in writing and in telling of my story. I use many forms for writing for my healing. Mostly I write in my journal, poetry, and essays. I also worked with Christina Chan to write a short play called Breaking Silences about young Asian American women and their mental health. And as I write, I learn things about myself. For example, I'm going to share a poem with you that exemplifies this point. It's called How Do You Fix a Broken Mind? How do you fix a broken mind? When I was 16, my despair tugged at my legs, pulling me under the surface, drowning me as I gasped for air, for a reason to live, for a way out of the abyss. I believed that I was worthless, unworthy of love, so broken that no repair was possible, so broken that I knew my life was not worth living. How do you fix a broken mind? I survived despite my attempt to close the door on this life, survived despite my pain and the constant omnipresent darkness and the sense that death was waiting right around the corner. How do you fix a broken mind? For years, I endured my life of brokenness, endured the suffering of my mind. I want to say when you were born, my darkness vanished, but it did not. And I believe at the same time a shift began. For I believe that as your mother, I made a contract with Spirit to not abandon you by my own volition, to not yield to my own desperateness. I was obligated to live, if not for me, then for you. If I were obligated, then healing was the only possible path. Healing is not easy. There is no quick fix, no duct tape to stick the pieces of my mind together. It was more of a decision or an idea that I felt I had no choice but to follow. How do you fix a broken mind? Decide that life is the only possible choice. So in this poem, helped me really understand my relationship with suicidality and the fact that I had come to believe over time that I did have choices and that I could choose to live. In addition, as I share my story, I shed some of the shame that lingers about being a person with lived experience or as an Asian American in a white culture. And my hope is that my story might help someone else as well. And as an educator, I found story to be one of the best ways to engage people in approaching and understanding new knowledge or uncomfortable subjects. And I've told my story dozens of times in different contexts and for different purposes. For example, to break the silence and stigma about mental illness, specifically in the Asian American community, or to illustrate the concepts of culturally relevant treatment and the lack of mental health services for people of color, or to examine intergenerational trauma. So there's power in storytelling. Stories pass on history and information, including cultural information, both in families and society. Stories can create empathy among people with backgrounds. Stories can create new knowledge and narratives, or maintain narratives such as rules and norms of dominant culture. Stories can also counter the assumptions about another experience. They illustrate that Black, Indigenous, people of color, or BIPOC are not all the same. We have nuanced stories that are unique, but sometimes can have common themes. Narratives can counter stereotypes and can allow for the claiming of experiences that are not defined by the dominant culture. A poem I wrote called A Response to Questions About My Mixed Heritage does this. A response to questions about my mixed heritage. What are you? What am I? Is this a trick question? What happens if I get it wrong? What I am is not static. What I am is dynamic and sometimes overwhelming, sometimes too much to bear. This is not what they mean. What I am is colorful. What I am is strident, persistent, and a pain in the ass. This is also not what they mean. What I am is Cassandra, a samurai, a witch, a seeker, a teacher, and a learner. This too is not what they mean. What am I? I am enough. This poem helped me understand hold on. This poem illustrates how I can claim my experience that is counter to the dominant culture's desire to put me in this box and define what I am. And there are many ways to tell stories: poetry, video, narrative, journalism, plays, etc. And protests are happening because finally white people and non-Black people of color could understand that human beings behind the many murders of Black people and feel connected to the loss. Unfortunately, it took these stories being caught on camera to have people believe them. And as a result of these stories being exposed, we are seeing some changes on multiple levels, including culturally and systemically. And the context for story is also important. Historical context of story is critical. For example, to understand my mother's story, you have to understand that she was struggling with having bipolar disorder in the 1950s and 60s, when a lot less was known about the illness than is now. She was in and out of hospitals that had very little effective treatments. It's also important to understand the history of the Japanese internment and the intergenerational trauma that resulted to understand my father's and my story. And some stories are silenced by the dominant culture. History is erased or revised to the benefit of the dominant culture and to maintain power structure of the dominant culture as well. For example, the history of indigenous people in this country is a story that has been both revised and erased. And the erasure of accurate history has allowed for many false narratives and erased the appropriate context that would allow people to understand the complex and horror of the full story. When you silence stories, especially those of BIPOC or other oppressed groups, you disempower us. You take away our identities, our truth, and our humanity. Stories are not just individual, but collective as well. How we define our own stories are related to the ways that our stories fit into the collective story and history. And if history has been silenced or revised, it affects us as individuals, and it affects whether we see our stories as valid. Silencing is not only about which stories are allowed to be told, but what stories are elevated. It's about who gets to tell the stories. For example, white producers and directors telling stories of BIPOC for their own purposes, as opposed to making space. And this, as we know, is common practice. And I am very lucky to be in a place to tell my story without major repercussions. And people of color also sometimes silence our own stories because we know that our stories are not welcome. And so we silence them ourselves. This silencing is insidious and not seen by the people from the dominant culture. Sometimes it is because of the need for safety and fear of repercussions. Sometimes it is due to internalized oppression, feeling that our stories are not worthy. And sometimes it's due to professional constraints, such as clinicians may feel that they are not allowed to tell their stories of their lived experience with mental illness because it may be perceived as showing weakness. So in the face of that silencing, it's important to own our stories and narratives. For the dominant culture has stories about us. For example, Asian Americans have been designated the model minority by the dominant culture. The model minority myth says that Asian Americans are doing well in terms of white norms and therefore don't need help. Americans as the model for other BIPOC and pits us against each other. It says if these Asian Americans are doing so great, it's your fault that you are not. The model minority is created by white people intentionally to uphold the dominant power structure and to divide BIPOC. This is a dangerous story, not beneficial to Asian Americans or other people of color, and it's used to training people to specific roles and imposing social consequences on those BIPOC box. Asian Americans are supposed to be quiet and not make waves, and this can be internalized as well. I wrote called The Apology illustrates this. I was once sitting with my friend Donna Ozawa, another Sansei daughter, another daughter of parents who were interned in camp during World War II, another daughter who spoke English perfectly and was told to go back where she came from. I remember she apologized about something. I don't remember what. Then I apologized for something else. Then we riffed on apologies. Sorry for wearing blue. Sorry for taking up space. Sorry for speaking so loudly. Sorry for breathing the air. We laughed. But it's not really funny. Silence through apology, as if our very existence was an affront, as if we have something to apologize for. In this poem, I articulate one way Asian Americans have silenced ourselves through the act of apology. Another dominant narrative that the culture holds about Asian Americans is that we are implicated in the spread of COVID-19 in the United States. The story goes that Chinese Americans spread COVID in the US. And first, this has not only been proven repeatedly to be a false narrative, but it has increased the racism against Asian Americans in this country. And these examples shows ways that narratives are both personal and that they have affected me and other individuals, but they are also systemic, and that some media outlets and some people in power perpetuate these narratives. And even our families can have false narratives about us. For example, for many years, I was a designated patient in my family. And this meant that how I was perceived was limited and constructed through a lens of being mentally ill, rather than seeing me as a whole person. And furthermore, when growing up, stories are one way our cultural identity gets formed and supported. What stories are told and what stories are not told shape who we are and how we define ourselves. My father didn't share much of his history except when I asked about the internment camp experience in 11th grade. Yet later, my dad came to understand that his Japanese Americanness, he came to understand his Japanese Americanness through my sisters and my own exploration of our own racial identities as young adults, which countered the assimilationist narrative of the good American that he grew up with. And when you claim your own narrative, particularly in the face of dominant culture trying to erase it, it illustrates a point of resilience. In addition, hearing other people's narratives who share your experience can have the same effect. Claiming your story is an act of resistance, as it allows you to define yourself and your experience. It's a way to subvert the dominant culture and what it expects of you, and provides an example for others to do the same. And stories can also be acts of protest. As in the poem I wrote, thoughts and prayers are not enough. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. What would you say if I told you he died? What would you say if I told you he was killed? What would you say if I told you he was assassinated? How could this be? Words escape you, escape me. He was an NIH scientist. He was a father. He was a tenor. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Who killed him and why? We do not know. We only know he was shot 4 times in the head and chest. The police said it was a robbery, but they didn't take the iPhone in his pocket or his wallet or the keychain on which hung our gold wedding band. They just took his life. What a shame, you say. Each time, what a shame. Sending thoughts and prayers, what a shame. Newtown, what a shame. Parkland, what a shame. Oh, Orlando, what a shame. Shame. Shame on you, shame on me. Shame on a country where guns are easier to get than health insurance. Shame. What a shame. This poem excuses my personal story with the murder of my best friend and ex-husband in Baltimore to protest gun violence and mass killings. So witnessing and how these stories are heard is important. And it's important when we witness other stories to do it without judgment, especially if the story is being told by a person of an oppressed group. We need to make space for that person to tell their story and not be judgmental or critical. And there's issues of safety in telling your story. And I believe it is primarily the responsibility of the dominant culture to make it safe. But we know that is not always the case. In fact, often it is not. It can be risky to tell your story, particularly if you're saying things that challenge the dominant culture and structures. It can also be risky if you yourself are not ready to tell your story. The stories can be revealing of personal truths. For example, I was a planner of a conference and we had a young woman with lived experience speak, but she was not ready to tell her story and she broke down. From then on, the conference organizers make sure that people who have lived experience understood the risk of going public and were ready to tell their stories. And in 2009, I was interviewed by Psychology Day on living with severe depression. But before I agreed to the interview, I had to think hard about whether I wanted to be out there with my story. I finally decided to do the interview, but realized that there was no going back. And this was fully illustrated by the fact that I was stopped in the street by a friend who had seen the article. This was the first of many times that I've shared my story, but it was also a pivotal point in me going public. A word on appropriation of other stories. So it is not acceptable to appropriate the stories of others, which happens in many situations, such as fiction or in film, where white authors or directors appropriate stories of other cultures. It also happens in research, and I believe researchers who are interested in the stories of others need to work with them in a collaborative way and be guided by those being researched. So how does this relate to suicide prevention? Well, first, hearing stories of people who look like you help you feel connected and not alone. We can understand ourselves through hearing others' stories. Stories are one of the best ways to cultivate empathy. And we also know that media stories, if told insensitively, can be harmful not only to the subjects of the stories, but the communities to which the subjects belong, and also to the field of suicidology as a whole. We work to save lives, but sensationalized media stories work against us by spreading misinformation and sharing too many specific details, making it possible for things like suicide contagion. It's critical for people with lived experience to be able to tell their stories in ways that are both true to themselves and not harmful to the audience. There can also be an inherent tension in this because placing guidelines about safe messaging can feel like censorship. However, I believe there's a balance between speaking one's truth and safeguarding the collective and the community. And finally, cultural humility can be fostered through stories. It's imperative that we all work with cultural humility. It's not just for clinicians. It's important to maintain a questioning stance toward others' cultural experiences and not assume that if you're an outsider of a particular culture, that you can be competent in that culture and its norms. And as a field, we need to elevate the voices of BIPOC and make space for these stories to inform the way we do suicide prevention and the way we approach mental health. Also, in terms of impacted family and friend stories, we need to hear more of these stories because the needs of impacted and family and friends have not been acknowledged or addressed in the field of suicidology. We have not been validated as a legitimate perspective. So many of us are in this category and can relate to the stories of other impacted family and friends. And we need to expand these narratives to include the many perspectives and cultural lenses that shape this experience. The more stories we have, the more understanding and healing can happen. And finally, stories can connect people with each other and to something larger than ourselves and can expand our perspectives. Stories provide a window into unique experiences, and this is a gift. Writing and sharing our stories can facilitate our emotional healing and resilience, and we need to dare to tell our stories despite the resistance to them. In the words of poet Audre Lorde, "And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it's better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive." And that concludes the formal part of my talk. Hello, everybody. I was just looking at my PowerPoint there. So I'm hoping to have a conversation about some of the things that I shared. And I would love it if anyone has questions. And if you don't have questions, I have questions for you. So that's a teacher in me, right? I can't get away from it. So let's see. Does anyone have either questions about my lived experience or comments on the use of story as a way to get at these experiences? And you can write it in the chat or you can speak up, but I'd love to have a conversation. So someone needs to dare to break the ice. No one has any questions or thoughts or responses? Did it resonate?
I raised my hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Barrett.
Well, first of all, thank you for telling the story. When you hear about this much adversity and trauma, one has to think it's incredible you survived. And it certainly suggests an incredible amount of strength. I had a really simple question. Have you ever been to Japan? And if so, how did that impact you?
Well, I actually haven't been to Japan, but my father went to Japan as an adult for the first time as, he was, middle age. And he grew up, as you know, during the internment. And one of the things that happened was he didn't learn Japanese. So so people would react to him, of course, as a Japanese man, but he didn't speak any of the language, except the only thing he understood was the mothers scolding their children, which I thought was pretty amusing. But I don't speak any Japanese either, which is unfortunate because he, because of the camps, they didn't learn Japanese, and of course he didn't pass that down. But I am planning on going to Japan. I hope, assuming COVID settles down enough to actually travel internationally in a couple of years, because I'm going to be turning 60, and my daughter and I want to go together during that. But I think it should be very interesting to go and to really experience, the Japanese culture and what that's like.
I would mention that my daughter is Korean, adopted at age 18 months, and she and I have been to Korea twice. And it was a very profound experience despite not speaking Korean. And when we landed the first time, she said jokingly but seriously, "Finally, I'm back with my people."
Yeah, I actually had a very similar experience because I grew up on the East Coast and moved to the West Coast as a 20-something. And the first time I went to Japantown, I grew up in, primarily white communities, so there was no one who looked like my dad. And all of a sudden, everyone looked like dad. And I was like, everyone looks like dad here. How is that possible? Because I just hadn't grown up with it at all. But yeah, it's interesting. It'll be interesting.
Thank you again.
Sure, thank you. So I see a question about if people are afraid of writing and doubting their capacity, how's the best way to introduce a writing of story? That's a really interesting question, just because I was a high school English teacher before this iteration of myself, and did a lot of teaching of writing. I think the best thing to do is to let people off the hook and tell them that it's not school, that we are in a place where your story is important and really validating people's story. And then I think a lot of times the best way is to start with some kind of prompt and let people, a memory, prompt about memory. It could be a prompt about almost anything, and getting them to just write freely without worrying about grammar and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of times there's that, and realizing that something, when you first write it, is just a first draft, and you have lots of revision possibilities and polishing possibilities, but getting your story out in its raw form is actually very important. And also, I think for me, writing has been something that has helped me understand myself. So the writing in a journal, the writing for myself, because I think there's different kinds of writing. There's writing for oneself, which is really meant to not be shared, or shared very limitedly in terms of what your own comfort. And then there's writing for an audience. And so then if you're writing for an audience, and things like what you think about in terms of what the audience, who the audience is, what their expectations are, what they know already, all those things come into play. But I do think that I've done a lot of writing workshops, and my experience has been, if you give people permission to just write from their heart, that A, the writing is very good because it's really from their personal experience, and B, they can, speak their story in their language. And I think that can be really powerful. So thank you for asking that. And if you have more questions about that, specifically about prompts and stuff, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to share things I've done. It was on there, but I'll put it here too. My email is that. Oops, no, Yes, I give it just to Natalie, but let me do it to everybody. Other questions or comments or thoughts? So, I mean, yeah, Melissa.
I wanted your talk made me think about, in my family, stories were endemic. And there's a lot of cultures where information is conveyed by story. And those structures, the language used, the images used, the narrative used, varies in different cultures. And your talk made me think about how being in a dominant culture makes it hard, and the expectation of how stories should be structured and told is actually very limited. And so there aren't a lot of outlets as children from different cultures are growing up in school for the form and way in which they tell their story, even a bilingual story.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that I actually have learned is that in terms of story and sharing story is that I taught poetry, and poetry, when you let children understand that it's a lot more fluid and they don't feel as constrained. So some of the best poems that came out of the poetry writing I did in a 9th grade classroom were the 2 Chinese girls who couldn't speak English very well, because they could tap in to images or things that they noticed without having to worry about the fact that their verb tense didn't agree, and things like that. So I think there are ways to get around that if you're teaching story. I also think that I think as parents, particularly if our kids are very verbal and that kind of thing, you can do a lot with family storytelling that is outside of the structures of the dominant culture and the structures of the 5-paragraph essay and all that kind of stuff they teach in school. So I think there are some ways to approach that, both from an educational standpoint as well as from a familial standpoint. But I just think even just allowing kids to tell their story and not interrupt them. I mean, when we ask kids, a lot of times they'll tell a story, right? They'll go on for a while if you let them. And I think a lot of times as parents, I know I'm certainly guilty of this. You shut them down. I'm making dinner, right? I don't have time for this. So, I mean, so part of it is just being really aware of the power of story in people's lives and in children's lives in particular. Other thoughts? And people, if you have other ideas about what someone else asked, please contribute. Other questions or thoughts? So I talked about cultural humility and my experience as an impacted family member and experience of intergenerational trauma. And I'm wondering if other people have those questions, either questions about that or experiences with those concepts in their lives or their work. I
have another question.
Sure.
I wrote down your list of challenges, including racism, mental illness in the family, your own PTSD, your ex-husband's murder, and your daughter's challenges. Which would you say was the greatest challenge for you, or perhaps one or two that really pushed you to the limit more than anything else, or are they all equal?
Well, they play out differently. I think certainly having a mother who was very compromised, and it was during a time when fathers weren't really allowed to have custody of their children, even if the mother was compromised. So we were in that family unit for a long time with my mother. And that had an impact on me that I didn't even realize it had on me until I was much older and was in therapy and could unpack it. I mean, I didn't really understand the impact that that intergenerational mental health issues had on me. And then, but I think the thing as an adult, certainly the death of my ex-husband, who murder of my ex-husband, who was also my very, very best friend. And so that shaped things that went after that. I mean, it was, both my daughter's, trauma experience. He was murdered right outside their house. So she was on the porch. I mean, it was a real bad situation. So that impacted me. And I do a lot of writing about that. I've done a lot of poetry writing, a lot of different kinds of writing about that experience and how hard that was to understand. And it's a different kind of thing than, someone, the same year my father died in 2012 and he was murdered, my ex-husband was murdered in 2012. So my daughter and I lost our fathers the same year, which was really challenging. I mean, my father died of natural causes and in the best way that's possible in natural causes. Obviously the murder was more traumatic. But I think that those kinds of things, they're pivotal points, and how you deal with them is really important. I think one of the things that I had when I was an adult and Peter was murdered was I had skills. I mean, I had done a lot of therapy, I had done a lot of work on myself, and I had ways of coping that if it had happened earlier, I wouldn't have had. And that helped me help my daughter too, having those skills. So I think that this whole thing, and that there are points in your life where something happens that's really dramatic. And I think how you deal with it, in part depends on how well equipped you are, emotionally speaking. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again.
Sure. And so someone's asking, I wonder how my father's silence affected me, and was I aware of it at the time, or maybe not until later. It's interesting that you ask about that, because my father, I don't know if I said this, my father was a very silent man in general. I mean, he was not a person to share how he felt. It was, he was a man of a particular time and a particular culture where those kinds of feelings were not shared. And I was so different from him. I think I remember one time I was doing the Myers-Briggs and I said to him, "Dad, you and I are exactly the opposite." And he was a little older at the time, and he kind of looked at me and he said, "Well, that's not necessarily a bad thing." But I think it made it hard growing up for us to really understand each other. And his silence about his growing up was really not broken until he was much older. My sister, who is a researcher, did some family interviews with him, which is where his voice in that movie came up. That was his voice when he was talking about the camps and being tagged and that kind of thing. That was my dad. And, he was, the silence about his life, probably wasn't really aware of until later, in terms of how that affected me and how I sort of tried to understand how the trauma of the camps affected our family. And when I rode my bike across the country, which I mentioned in my introduction, we drove back and we drove through Topaz, which you saw the cracked ground. Those are pictures from that trip of actually going to the site where my dad was interned, which was very powerful and sort of, it was very creepy actually. Because all that was there at the time was those cracked places, the foundations of the buildings, and that American flag with the plaque. And so it was very barren, very, very barren. And they have recently, I mean, if you're interested in Japanese American history, they put there's a museum in Topaz, Utah right now that they erected after 2012 when I was there. And that tells about, the history of the camps and that kind of thing. Any other questions or thoughts? I'm just wondering from all of you, how have you used story in your work, and or how has or your life, and in what ways have you done that? Are there ways that you can see this as a healing modality, either for yourself or for others?
Hi, I'm Teresa, and I haven't used it in the past, but I can see it may be a great tool going forward in helping people to open up and release and maybe get in touch with some past stories that they have to share.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it can be. I mean, I don't, I also feel like sometimes we put too much of a burden on the idea of being a writer or an author, you know what I mean? And it's like we're all authors. We can all be writers. All you have to do is put the, either the pen to the paper or the, the keyboard, and you're a writer. It's not about some kind of lofty thing. It's that we all have stories to tell, and they're all really important. And it can be very healing too. And sometimes I think people have bad, my experience is that some people have bad experiences in school that prohibit them from feeling comfortable with the writing. And I think that it's worth working through and, trying to experiment with that. My daughter, interestingly enough, is not particularly a writer. She's not, she doesn't resonate with that, but she's an artist. And so she does a lot of art related things, which is another way I think we can work with our own emotions, is through art. I do a lot of collage. I'm also a jewelry maker, but the collage is also a good way to express oneself, because I feel like part of what story does is express parts of ourselves that either are hidden or that we don't, we haven't really looked at, and it brings it outside of ourselves so we can look at it, and so we can share it if we choose to. When I was really struggling very deeply, I did a lot of collages that actually are housed in my therapist's office because I didn't want them in my house. They were very dark, but they got it out of me, right? I mean, I was dealing with these heavy emotions. It got it out on the paper, and then I gave it to him, and he's holding it. So there's ways that I think we can use art and stories and writing to be able to really get things beyond our own mental space and bring them into the light for ourselves as well as for others. Other comments or questions?
Pava?
Yeah. Hi, Marie.
Hey. First, I want to say, as always, you have an incredible gift to reach out and grab us all by the heart. In that, I don't think I will ever tire of my conversations with you in hearing more and more about this. And I wanted to thank you for bringing up the connection to impacted family, because as you know, one of the things that we continue to discuss in working with this group is just how much has the generational intersectionality impacted people, and they may not even know it, when it comes to mental health, when it comes to suicide, trauma in general. So I wanted to thank you for that. I suspect over the next few years working together, we're going to be pulling off layer after layer after layer. And for those who may not understand the definition within suicidology, an impacted family member means that we have been emotionally impacted or traumatized by the non-fatal suicidal crises or experiences of our loved ones. Suicide attempt, chronic suicidal thinking, Barry's specialty, non-suicidal self-injury, anything that brings someone to that threshold of suicidal ideation. We number in the millions. There's absolutely, by the way, no research on us yet. Maybe in the next couple of years that might happen. But we know, Potter and I have talked about this a lot, as well as the others in our division at AAS, the American Association of Suicidology, that so many people are wandering around and just not knowing what's happening, what that little thing inside that it doesn't quite settle down is. And it could be that you fall into our little group, and so you're always welcome. So Potter, hats off to you again.
Thank
Um,
you.
Really rang the bell, as always.
Thank you. So we have another question about when did I start to feel safe with storytelling, and how related is it to doing therapy and that sense of safety. I started writing for myself in journals when I was in junior high school. I still have one piece of a journal from 1976, and I have the first time I was hospitalized after my suicide attempt was in 1979, and I have the journal from that year, which is interesting to look back at. So I started writing and doing this kind of writing piece sort of by accident in certain ways. I mean, I just started doing this. It may have started with a journal in school. I mean, girls in that generation had diaries, and I certainly had my share of diaries. But I wrote probably starting from being a junior or senior in high school pretty regularly, and that was before I started any therapy or anything like that. But certainly therapy, I mean, I don't think I was ever encouraged in therapy necessarily to write because I was already writing. But I feel like it has been a tool that I've been able to use in therapy, because, when something happens, I might write about it. And then if I bring that incident into therapy, I have a different perspective on it because I've already written about it. And so I have a more of a metacognitive look at it too. I'm like, oh, this thing happened to me. I can read how I felt at that moment, right? Like how intense was that experience? But then the therapist and I both have the ability to look at it from outside of ourselves. So that has been helpful. And I think the safety in story is really important. And I think the first safety is being clear that what I write for myself is really for myself. So, for instance, I would never, if my daughter kept a diary, I wouldn't read her diary ever, right? Because that's like a violation of the basic tenet that she has a right to her own story. And I mean, there are ways that, I might ask her about it, or or ask her specific things, but I wouldn't I would make sure that there was safety for her to explore her own way of thinking or her own stories herself. But then there's the safety of telling your story, and that's something that's different, I think. If you don't have safety in telling your story, it can be very damaging, I think. If you're in a situation where you're going to be attacked for your story, or you're going, because and a lot of stories are personal, and so then it's not only are you being attacked for your story, but you're being attacked personally, or it feels that way, right? So I think that's really important in relation to therapy and in other things. Like if you're sharing your story with your therapist, you need to be sure that therapist is going to be respectful and understand the purpose of that story. And when that doesn't happen, I think we need to speak up if you feel violated, or like this therapist is twisting your story or using your story. And therapists are just people, right? So, there are ways that you have to be able to say, as a client or a consumer, whatever they want to call us these days, you have to be ways to be able to assert yourself and your story. And, even with a listener who is trying to unpack it for you and help you do that. Let's see, I have. let's see. So there's a comment. You can see that. Yeah, the comment brings up issues of how frightening it is actually to have a friend whose mom died by suicide and then being afraid that friend will do the same. And I think that's the impacted family and friends perspective, right? Where you have someone in your sphere where you are scared that, and you feel concerned that that person is suicidal or is struggling, and you don't know, sometimes you don't know what to do with it. I mean, that fear. And one of the things that I think is really important that I've learned from Anne Marie, who spoke about impacted family and friends, as well as my own understanding of this, is that it's really important for those of us who are impacted family and friends to take care of ourselves. Because if we are running on empty, there's no way we can help the other person. So if I'm running on empty, there's no way I can help my daughter if she calls me at 3 a.m. There's just no way. So I need to realize that, and it's really interesting because I have a lot of support system now that I've worked hard to get. And I know I can feel myself separating my needs from hers. Like she'll call me and she'll be really upset. In fact, it happened right before this webinar. And so I was talking to her, and she's retelling a story actually about someone who had injured her verbally. And I have to be level-headed and rational and kind and hopefully and supportive. And I'm having my own reaction, like, how can this person do that to you? And this is terrible. And I mean, I'm mad as get out, right? But I'm not expressing that to her in the same way. I mean, certainly, letting her know that I think this is not right, and some self-righteous anger is useful. But it's also the case that going overboard is not with my reaction. But I have places to take my reaction, and I'm aware of that. So I think that's, when you're an impacted family person, it's really important to take care of yourself and to realize what your parameters are. And the issue of boundaries is really important, and where you can help and where you can't. Because, look, with my mother, there's only so much I could do. But that's really important. And since mental health concerns often run in families, we see this a lot in impacted families, right? In impacted family and friends. We see, and like my family, it's riddled with mental health concerns. And I think that understanding both the impact of the mental health concern itself and on the individual, but also on the whole family system, is really important. Any other thoughts or questions or comments or?
Another question. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations about dealing with racist comments?
Well, yeah. Just as a shout out first, Jennifer Kelleher and I are doing a series of webinars in this series based on this toolkit for racial equity and social justice I mentioned earlier in my introduction. And as part of that, we talk about white allyship in particular, and how white people can be, elevate the voices of people of color. But in terms of racist comments, I think it's very contextual, actually, because, and I don't mean to say this to avoid the question, but it depends, for instance, on safety. Like, how I respond to a racist comment will depend on whether I feel safe enough to talk to that person. I mean, there are situations where I may not feel safe enough, or where, I'm out in public and I've had a situation where I was, some guy was ranting about immigration, staring at me and moving closer and closer, and I did not feel safe. So I walked very quickly away from that and didn't confront it at all, even though, it could have been a learning opportunity maybe, but it wasn't a safe opportunity. So there's that piece. I mean, I do think that with my closest folks, my inner circle, I am working on confronting, microaggressions and those kinds of things, because it's important for people to know when they've stepped on your toes, or they've hurt you in a way. And it's so easy to be silent for me. I mean, certainly for me, it's easy to just sort of say, oh, that's just so and so, and not really address the concern. Now, I do a lot of diversity training, so I'm put in the position where I actually have to speak out about it. So that's not a personal thing. It's more of a professional, specific thing where I will say, that's racist because of this reason, and and that can be received in many ways. It can be received as, oh, okay, let me think about this, let me try to change, whatever. It can also be received as, you're ridiculous, and this is the way we do it here, and speak English, kind of thing. That, which is that whole. I mean, I've been actually asked by people, do I speak English, which is kind of crazy. So it's sort of like, what are you talking about? So there's ways in which that I think, it depends on where you are, who you're with, and whether you feel safe enough to respond. Now, there's lots of ways, and because of the all of the uprisings and all the things that are going on in today's world, there are lots of webinars and things about confronting racism, both as a white ally, as well as a person of color, as well as in the Asian American community, looking at anti-Blackness. And there's a lot of things out there about how to negotiate all of this. And I think it's really worth looking at if you're interested in it, and trying to figure out, well, how do we make a more equitable society? And I think part of that is through confronting people when it's safe enough, particularly for people of color. And this is where I really feel like it's so important to have white allies who are willing to speak up too. So Jen and I work together as a team. And there'll be times when she might take on a question, particularly if it's a white person saying something that's racist, because she knows that for me to do it is exhausting. It's exhausting. It's exhausting to face that. And it's exhausting to have to do it just through your everyday life. And then on top of that, you're in a something, and someone says something, and it's like, okay, how are we going to deal with that? So, I mean, there's like many layers to this question, and thank you for asking it. But I do think that it's something that as a society, we have to unpack, how does racism really work? Because there's overt racism, and then there's microaggressions, and then there's adversive racism, where people don't even, it's so embedded in our culture that people don't even see it. They don't even see the ways that people of color and Black, Indigenous people are slighted and silenced and, et cetera. It's invisible. And then people can react from that quote unquote norm that just is quote unquote the norm, right? And not realize that actually they're perpetuating a racist structure. So yeah, my brief thoughts on that. If you're interested, you should come to our next webinar is going to be on whiteness and on white issues of white allyship and white fragility, and how to negotiate that in suicide prevention. So that will be next week, actually. Other questions, thoughts, concerns? Melissa, did you have something else?
Yeah, this is a bit change of subject back to something you had said earlier in terms of how would we use stories. And my great grandfather was a rigger on a whaling ship up in Maine, and he had passed away, and I was very close to my great grandmother, and she used to tell me stories and sing. And in college, I took a class in ballads, and for the final paper, I talked a lot about this experience with my great grandmother. And it ended up where I called my mother, she called my sister, And we all ended up talking about our great grandmother and her stories and songs. So another way that storytelling can be used as a tool is for within families, asking your family about their history or their stories,
Mhm.
and maybe recording it, whatever the comfort level is another way. But real quickly, the other thing I wanted to say, since we're talking about story, is I had a friend who was an immigrant tell me a very intense story about coming to America. And so there's the whole aspect of active listening, and I wondered if you could talk about that, and that it helps to see story as sacred, which I do, and someone telling your story is, to me, ritualistic and important that it have the proper container. I wondered if you could talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. I talked a little bit in the thing about witnessing stories and hearing stories, but I do think that one thing about story is that it's very personal. Usually, you know, it's about families, it's about lives, and you know, when we try to take it down, when we attack it, or when we say it's not valid, or it's not real, or it's not whatever, we do serious harm both to the individual as well as to whatever culture or community that person's coming from. So I think it's really important to hear story as a gift, and as Melissa said, as sacred, and as a way to really get a window into someone else's experience. And with, you know, because the more we can do that, I believe the more we can understand each other and understand both the differences as well as the similarities. So, and sometimes it's hard because sometimes people will be telling a story that goes against your experience, perhaps, or is telling a story that is very, very different. But if we can see the stories, particularly personal stories, as gifts, as ways of looking at the world, as ways of connecting with each other, as ways of understanding a different experience, I think that becomes a way that we can receive the story without having to judge it and having to put on our, you know, because part of the dominant culture is, I mean, I got a PhD. I have academic training. And part of the academic training is to put a hole in the other person's argument, right? That's sort of the purpose of it, right? Is to like attack the story, right? And I think that's culturally something we do quite a bit, is we try to find the thing that's wrong. We try to find the way that it doesn't work, or that, you know, that there's a hole in the story. We try to catch someone. But if we can remove those lenses and say, all right, let's put those aside and just receive the story as their truth, it becomes a little bit different, I think. It becomes less of a challenge to who you are and more of a gift about who they are. So that's just some thoughts about that. But I think it's really important to try to be as non-judgmental as possible when addressing these stories.
Hi.
Hi.
First, I want to say thank you so much. This has been really informative and helpful. I'm thinking about when you talked about storytelling and suicide prevention, and how storytelling fosters cultural humility.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just been thinking about that this whole time. And I have my own thoughts, but could you elaborate on that a little
Sure,
bit?
I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, from telling my story,
Mhm.
I have experienced a healing process. The charge, each time I say it, it's less and less and less. And so that I have experienced, but it's only with people that I trust that I've shared a story with. And I am now at a place where cultural humility it's a necessity for us all. But to get to a place where one can experience cultural humility, that self-healing has to happen first.
Right.
And how can the healing happen if the story's not told? And so there's so many people that won't share their story, won't even write their story, well, won't write it, but won't even speak it.
Right.
And so, I mean, in the course, there are a lot of moving parts related to someone's healing, of course,
Right.
but in respect to writing and storytelling, how else does it foster cultural humility?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And thank you for sharing a little bit of your experience. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
You know, I think a couple things. One is that I think you're starting with the people around you for the healing piece makes a lot of sense, right? Certainly for me too, like just telling my story a little bit and not going public with it, not going in a place where people could attack me, you know, where I had a receptive audience. I think cultural humility, again, it's like we have to be brave enough to tell our stories when we're ready. When we're ready. I'm not saying anyone should, you know, go beyond when they're ready. Because I think that it's really the only way that people without our experience are going to get a window into the experience. Now, I mean, literature tries to do this all the time, right? We read a novel that's really moving and it's a story and we relate to it, even though the characters might be really different than we are. But so I think that telling the story can help someone see a window into a different culture, which is, and realize that that culture, you know, is unique and of its own, right? I mean, because when, you know, when people don't have cultural humility, and, you know, a lot of times in the field of psychology, people talk about cultural competence, which I think is actually not possible. How can you be competent in someone else's culture? You can be knowledgeable, maybe, you can know something about it, you can learn, you can talk to people, you can listen to the stories, but you're not in the culture. So how can you be competent in the culture if you're not in the culture? Now, that being said, I think the stance that clinicians, and I'm not a clinician, so I'm making a, you know, a statement from the other side of the whatever. But I think the, in terms of clinicians or in all of our work in suicide prevention, we need to think about being able to ask questions and being open to someone else's experience, to have the cultural humility to realize that we cannot know what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. We can't, you know, I mean, but that we can be curious and we can be open and we can be non-judgmental in our listening of the stories, which is really what cultural humility is about, is being able to listen to someone else's story and listen to someone else's reality in their culture, in their world, and realize that you don't know and you can't know because, you know, you're a different person. You come from a different framework. And I think particularly oppressed people in this culture, you know, their stories about, you know, I mean, that's how we can create some cultural humility, I think, because so many of those stories are silenced. And, you know, so first we have to make it safe enough for people to tell their stories. And then we have to listen to the stories as gifts and as ways to understand someone else's reality and culture. So if you had, you know, I don't know, 50 African-American women's stories, and, you know, we're sharing them all, and you could look at them and see all the range of experience and whatever, you would get a window, right, into that experience. Now, are they the same? No. That's part of the beauty of it, actually, is that they're not the same, right? We have our unique experiences. Are there themes? Probably themes, right? And we know this too, just by when we're in a group of people that are similar to us, or we meet a person for the first time and they have an experience that's similar to ours. there's a connection there, right? Because we have a piece of the same story. Like my poem about the apology with Donna Ozawa, who was a friend of mine. You know, she's Japanese American, third generation, same situation, and her parents were in camp, and we had this instant connection because we shared this little piece of story here. And and then we got to know each other and we're friends. But but there's like ways in which connecting happens in stories, as well as the ability to see someone else's reality as different. I don't know if that helped. Any other thoughts?
Thank you.
Sure. So we're getting close to end of time, and I appreciate everyone who participated in this conversation. It was really interesting for me to have people's thoughts. And I put my email in the chat box, so if you are interested, feel free to email me if you have other thoughts or comments. And thank you all for coming and participating and listening to me babble on for a while.
Dr. Sakamoto, thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed today's webinar. And I'm sure everyone else did too. I hope everyone looks to the Suicide Prevention Program's website for more information on our additional webinars on suicide prevention, in addition to our racial equity and suicide prevention resources that can be found on the program's website as well. So again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you again.
Mhm.